Okay. Biodiversity net gain are three words that we hear a lot about, and in England certainly, and biodiversity enhancement in Scotland and Wales. So it's something that we're all doing in one form or another. And Paul Mellor, who works for the Transport for London, is going to talk to us about the importance of local data for biodiversity net gain from a planning perspective.
Okay, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, the importance of biodiversity net gain data for local planning authorities. So just as way of an introduction, my name is Paul Mellor. I'm perhaps in a slightly unusual position of being both a qualified town planner, a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute, and also a member of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. So I started my career as a planner through local authority. My previous position was at Bromley Council, and I was a policy planner there where we focused on green infrastructure and biodiversity net gain, as and when biodiversity net gain became an area of policy that was important. And then more recently, I've moved across to work for Transport for London. So I'm an environment manager within an adaptation and sustainability team at TfL, and I focus on BNG, biodiversity net gain there. So I'm in a position where I can give a bit of feedback in terms of what's happening with the importance of data and work being done at local authority level with a perspective from two different local authorities, essentially. So firstly, the legislative requirements of BNG have been brought in by the Environment Act. So planning decisions now will rely on local biodiversity data to ensure that wildlife and habitats are considered during developments. So this presentation will take a look at the importance of data for local authorities when applying these requirements of the Environment Act, specifically for biodiversity net gain purposes. So I've tried to throw in a few photos where I can through our image bank at TfL. This is not particularly interesting one, that's just of the Northern Line extension, Kennington Place Park. So BNG and the need for data. So the Environment Act, you'll all be familiar with it. It introduces a strengthened biodiversity duty. So that means that local authorities have to look at how they conserve and enhance biodiversity. And there will be a key monitoring requirement there where local authorities will have to report their progress and measure this in order to be able to explain whether there's been a success or not in terms of biodiversity gain across local authorities' jurisdiction. This photo here is a bit of a nice one. This is of the Cut, which is just outside the TfL offices. That shows a nice tree line and a connected wildlife corridor there. So the main issue that I see with BNG and data is just the amount of data that's going to be coming into local authorities for management. So the requirements of BNG will introduce a lot of data, and this needs to be stored, managed, and monitored. So we're starting to see quite a lot of companies emerging with bespoke data handling and management packages, and these companies are obviously new to the market and are approaching local authorities with possible solutions. And I'm aware that there are several local authorities now that are starting to purchase such packages. But it is early days in terms of understanding the progress that's being made there and the pros and cons of each of these and how they're working for each local authority. In terms of data storage and reporting, our local data services, Giggle, Green Space Information for Greater London. So they have a service level agreement, I think, with almost every planning or local authority in London now. I think it's at least 30 of the 32. So I work for TfL, and that falls within the Greater London Authority, the GLA. And we also have a service level agreement with Giggle. And that's been really helpful for us to identify potential protected species and habitats, because of course they record both as part of their data sets, and that can be excellent value to us when we apply that data to planning sites in particular. So I think the terms of the Environment Act and the Biodiversity Net Gain requirements introduced does mean that there is a need for tools for planners to be able to work with this influx of data that's going to be just coming around the corner once we have net gain going live, which I think is likely to be early February now, given the delays to the statutory instruments and their passage through Parliament. So the main thing I'd like to talk to you about today is it's a bit of a cautionary tale, I suppose, of what can go wrong at local authority level if you don't have strong local data to supplement what's happening at your national level or regional level. So this particular site highlights why data capabilities are needed and what could be improved. So this is a site that is a planning application that was considered and approved before BNG was really a thing there. So bearing in mind, this predates the passage of the Environment Bill through to becoming an act. So whilst BNG was not a legal requirement, we found within the 12 to 18 months before that date that developers, ecologists, landscape management companies and design companies were all starting to get their act together in terms of BNG. And we found a lot of planning applications, particularly for major developments like this, were submitted with accompanying biodiversity net gain statements and reports and ecological information. The problem we had with this site is that the top image there is the site before, and on the left or western edge, you have an area of woodland. There's an area of unsealed surface or hard standing on the eastern side, but that section of land just in the centre is open mosaic habitat, which was not recorded. So essentially, when the application came in, it was submitted with a biodiversity statement, which essentially concluded that the site would result in a loss of biodiversity value. So the image at the bottom is the post-development site plan. So there's a block of flats there to the northwest and a row of terraced houses along the southern boundary. So all of that open mosaic habitat was lost, and we had a 53% biodiversity loss when measured using the biodiversity metric that DEFRA have published. So as I say, we had no detailed baseline data for the area. This meant that the council had to go to additional expense of hiring a consultant ecologist to assess the value of the site and scrutinise the data and information that was submitted to us by the developer. So whilst the impact on nature and wildlife there and biodiversity value was considered to be unacceptable, in terms of the overall planning balance, the application was permitted. Now, as I say, this is something that predated BNG, predated the tariff system and the idea of offsetting your losses on sites if you can't produce a BNG positive score on the site. So the council at that time had no local tariff system in place to apply to the developer, so therefore we couldn't charge compensation. Again, due to a lack of data, we had no aerial imagery data or habitat scoring in the borough at that time. And really, essentially, no local nature work happening to combine with the Green Space Information for Greater London data. So this is a similar point to that made by Adam earlier today. So what happened here was the developer ended up offering a financial contribution, which was covered by the legal agreement securing the land through planning, the Section 106 agreement. But again, because there was no data, there was no projects in place and no offsetting capabilities investigated by the council, that figure of money was just held by the council with no off-site initiative to apply it to. So I think that the lesson here is that had that council had habitat and biodiversity data of the area and the site itself, that would have assisted the council to understand the specific losses of biodiversity, the cost effects of that, and also how to apply any compensation where losses are unavoidable. So unfortunately, it was ended up being quite an aimless objective where we had a figure of money, and I've subsequently left this local authority, so I'm not sure what's happened next, but there's no real strategy in place at that time to offset losses, and that's partially driven by the fact that there's no data to argue either way on where to offset and what habitats might be prime candidates for further enhancements elsewhere or near to the site, ideally, really. So in terms of what local authorities can do, and at the point at which I left this particular local authority, they did have a service level agreement with Giggle, as I've previously mentioned. So there is, I think, a real issue with local authority funding. So whilst the Giggle information is very, very useful, it does provide a lot of good habitat information. I think because I think around about 40% of London local authorities lack an in-house ecologist or any expertise. And I think, in my opinion, I think a biodiversity net gain officer is probably also required at every planning authority level as well, alongside a data handling package if one does not exist, in order to manage the huge amounts of ecological and other data that's going to be submitted to local authorities on a daily basis from January onwards, or February onwards, really now. So there's also, I think, uncertainty over future funding. So DEFRA did announce a £9 million funding package for local authorities. That worked out at about £40,000 for each local authority. And that might be enough money to fund a position for a biodiversity specialist or an ecologist. But there's uncertainty over now how that funding will continue, if it will continue, whether it will be phased down and reduced and removed. And I think really in terms of how biodiversity is resourced at local level, that's a huge problem now, and it looks like it will continue to be so as councils are stretched within their budgets. I just wanted to kind of get just to have a shout out for the Plan Advisory Service here as well, because they've got a Biodiversity Net Gain network, and this has been a really useful resource and includes a base camp chat room, essentially, which includes a lot of information and sharing of experiences between authorities about how they're dealing with biodiversity net gain generally, but also they're starting to look at sharing information ideas about how they're going to store and use data for the benefit of biodiversity moving forward. And as I've said, some of these councils are starting to look towards external companies who can provide data support packages moving forward. So I'm going to talk about TfL and what they're doing and their procurement next. And that is perhaps a bit of a contrast between one local authority and another. So certainly this slide is showing some of our existing and proposed guidance at TfL. I'm just going to run through this very, very quickly because I want to talk about data specifically. So the corporate environment plan is TfL's broad environmental document. So I don't know whether you can see that clearly there, but in the bottom right corner of this slide is a section on green infrastructure, and it just says to protect, connect and enhance our green infrastructure, including the biodiversity, habitats and ecosystem services on our estate. So linked to that is our green infrastructure and biodiversity plan, which we're drafting and going through design with now. That's due to be published in February, hopefully, and that embeds the same vision that the corporate environment plan has. Our objective and our approach is to provide biodiversity net gain on our estate for all planning projects, and to seek to exceed the 10% minimum requirement as set out by the Environment Act, so that we can try to provide habitat banks, create new habitats, and where possible have a buffer in place so we can offset any project BNG losses that we might experience site by site, and create an overall positive score across the entire land that we own. Now, TfL's the largest landowner in London. It's quite an exciting opportunity because we have a ready-made network or skeleton of sites and wildlife corridors. So BNG, I think, provides us with a really exciting opportunity to make use of that existing network. And of course, data is going to be crucially important to informing that. So how are we preparing specifically in terms of data? So TfL is a local authority under the auspices of the GLA. So the requirements of the Environment Act apply equally to the GLA and TfL as they would do for any other local authority in the country. So the first thing we're doing is we undertook a baseline study using aerial imagery and satellite imagery in 2019 to provide a biodiversity score for our entire estate. It's now 5 years on from that, and we're looking to do an update of that study. That's going to provide us with a new set of data against which hopefully we can measure and report our biodiversity gains since 2019. What we're also going to do as part of that is look at a deeper dive into certain sites and try and identify our sites that have the potential to yield more biodiversity units. So where we have habitat that's perhaps in poor condition, or where it can be improved or enhanced in terms of its size. For instance, we have a lot of water in the southern part of London, a lot of balancing and attenuation ponds, which are in quite poor condition. And these are possibly prime candidates to identify for biodiversity net gain to help to create that habitat bank that I've just described. So this baseline will provide us with a lot of data, and that data will be vital for us to understand what we currently hold as an organisation in terms of what our biodiversity value is across our estate. We're also doing a tree canopy cover project, which is going to look at opportunities to plant trees in areas where there's very little tree canopy cover, or where we can target areas where we can provide further trees on the estate. That data set will also feed into this. And yeah, as I've mentioned, we have our own very specific challenges with data management, and we do have some in-house GIS systems which have been very useful for understanding trackside and roadside verge habitat, and managing the data that comes from the biodiversity values of those areas of land. But in terms of the specific information that BNG introduces, it's considered likely that we don't have a data handling package in-house, or that we can't build one that's going to be able to deal with the amount and the types of data that Biodiversity Net Gain introduces. So, for instance, you've got your ecological data that feeds into the system. We need to look at how we can understand the long-term management and monitoring requirements for sites. The Environment Act introduces a 30-year minimum requirement for the maintenance of the biodiversity units that you create through planning. We need to understand how the legal agreements attached to offsetting sites are managed and monitored over time. There's a lot of data handling specifics that we need to run through to understand what it is that we need it to cover, and then therefore go to market and try to see whether such a package exists, and how that can help us. So we're starting to do a lot of work to understand what we have in-house, what we need this information to be able to help us with, and how we can then look to procure. And that is a huge challenge with an organisation like TfL, because it's a very large, very complicated organisation, and it holds a lot of different data in different data sets. So to bring all of that information together is a very, very complicated matter. Part of my role there has been to introduce a Biodiversity Net Gain steering group, and that's to try and bring all the teams together to understand what processes do we need to do, what needs to change, what's currently holding us back in terms of achieving these biodiversity gains, and then identifying a range of actions and objectives in which to push forward and achieve what our overall goal is, and that is to really maximise biodiversity as far as possible, and not just meet the minimum 10%. It's worth, I think, saying that there's several local authorities now that have a greater than 10% minimum requirement. There's a few that are popping up in London through their new policies. And of course, we'll have to comply with those individual local plan policies where they apply. So that's an added complication. Just bearing in mind the time now, I'm just going to quickly run through a couple of things of what we're currently doing for nature. We've got quite a few good projects going on. We have an In Bloom annual staff competition to green our stations. That first top left photo is of Morden Station. We're going through quite a lot of work to introduce green roofs to our depot buildings. That's the top right photo there. And one that we're particularly proud of is the Wild Verge trial expansion. So last year we doubled our verge coverage roadside and trackside to 74,000 square meters, and we're looking to double that again in 2024. So, I mean, that's a really good example of how you can create significant biodiversity gain as part of a maintenance schedule without necessarily adding too much to the cost of maintenance. We've also undertaken a natural capital account in 2022, and that's shown us to have a positive natural capital asset value of about £330 million. And we think that's probably an underestimate. And that, of course, looks at entire ecosystem services and attaches economic value to it. So I've been talking for 20 minutes. I'm keen to allow time for questions. So just to summarise, really, I think BNG does introduce a substantial data requirement for local planning authorities, and it's going to be a challenge to comply with the Environment Act and embed BNG with the limited resources that local authorities possess. Data on BNG has the potential to be highly valuable, but without adequate systems and resource, local authorities will not be able to manage and store data and are likely to fail to report their BNG accurately in the absence of this. They'll also be unable to focus their BNG efforts where it can be of the best ecological value. Data use is therefore vital for councils if Biodiversity Net Gain is going to be a success over time. Thank you. I'll stop sharing there.